Hello and welcome to another edition of NeedleStack, brought to you by Authenticate. I'm one of your hosts today, AJ Nash. I'm a digital intelligence advocate over here. Got a long history in intelligence and intelligence community and all sorts of fun stuff like that. Most people probably know that. Rob, you want to introduce yourself as the co-host today?
I'm Robert, and I've got a background in security, so we make an interesting pair. And I'm really excited about this topic because as a journalist, I've covered how you can take a photograph and glean all sorts of insights as to where and how that photograph was taken. And so our guest today is going to start talking about that. AJ?
Yeah, exactly. So GEOINT is what we're going to talk about today, right? And we're joined by an expert, James Villenueve. James right now is founder and principal consultant for Perceptia Consulting, but he has a long history in geography and anthropology. He's got cool degrees from University of Victoria and British Columbia Institute of Technology, and I'm really excited to have this conversation too about all the things that go along with GEOINT and just what we can learn from this. So, James, I didn't give a lot of details, so you can fill in more of your background. Talk to us about where you came from, and then we'll jump into the topic.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I'm really excited to jump on here and have a really fun conversation about all things geospatial and also that kind of intersectionality of open source intelligence and geospatial. Yeah, I've got a pretty unique background. I usually have a hard time boiling it down into the elevator pitch. Definitely have more of an educational and kind of initial kickoff point in that world of remote sensing, satellite imagery being kind of the core area of my focus. And then over the years, so the last 8 years or so, I've spent most of that time in the open source intelligence arena, working for a few different vendors, probably the core one being EchoSec, in which I was one of the initial hires that joined the organization there to help scale the company. And it was, I would say, one of the earlier pioneers that took geospatial intelligence, geospatial information, and really strongly fused it with OSINT data sources. So happy to dive into it and looking forward to today's conversation.
Yeah, very cool. So listen, let's level set a little bit for folks who are just jumping on and saying, well, what's GEOINT, right? So we kind of mentioned a little bit. I know you talked about it as well, but just for everybody in the audience, when we talk about GEOINT, like what are we saying specifically? What is GEOINT?
Yeah, I feel like you can have that conversation. That could be the whole podcast episode. GEOINT, geospatial intelligence, to me is really just that understanding of the where behind information. So, that's about using maps. It's about imagery, location data, and kind of putting that context around events or patterns. Whether that's detecting changes in terrain, infrastructure, activity patterns, whether it's, analyzing movements and deployments in a critical conflict zone or, adversary movements. And then also maybe it's a time-lapse data set, time series data. So you're looking at, anticipation of actions or looking at historical trends. And then Rob, you kind of mentioned as well, one of the more, I would say, unique and novel sources, which is, interpreting the actual location within the pixels of an image, which seems to be where a lot of GEOINT and OSINT kind of fusing is taking place these days.
So I want to pick up on that. One of the stories that I've written about is of a Japanese actress who had photographs on her social media site, and somebody used the reflections in the mirrors, even in her eye, to determine like what building she was in and what floor she was on, et cetera, et cetera. That type of stuff is real.
Yeah, I mean, it's real in a variety of different sources. I think, one of the best ways to think about it is not always as, big budget movie as the twinkle in somebody's eye or the reflection in somebody's eye. Sometimes it's the metadata of a photo and you're picking up, lat long coordinates. I think, the origins of a lot of, geo referencing in open source intelligence has been metadata. That being said, I think we do see, a pretty impactful element of GEOINT right now being the analysis, and AI is obviously a huge help out here around the content, the pixels of an image, and being able to actually reference a specific place in the world based on maybe the background of an image, a specific, mountain range in the background. You see these kind of super locators online as kind of maybe the far end of it, or the human element of it. And then I think there's also a huge technical component as well.
So in photographs, they're EXIF data, and you can turn that off, like on your mobile phone, so it's not there. So in the past, that was the easiest way, because EXIF gives you a whole bunch of rich stuff to work with. But you're saying that you can just take it from the pixels and go from there. Yeah.
I mean, there's some really interesting companies out there. I'll give one shout out to GeoSpy. I think a pretty novel and up and coming company within the law enforcement and national security space that is doing exactly that. They're able to geo-reference a specific location solely based off of the pixels in the image. There's no background metadata taking place. They're not going and looking at the profile location of a Twitter account to then add to the enrichment. It is solely off of the image itself.
But it does open up some interesting opportunities for people who want to go a step further. Listen, I'm an old school Intel guy, as you know, as most people do. And there's a lot of folks, whether we're from the agencies and do some of that, or there's just hobbyists out there, OSINTers or professional OSINTers, not from the agencies, not to slight anybody, who do this in their free time just because it's like a fun challenge, right? There's all sorts of challenges on social media, like here's a picture, find where I am, right? And people start digging around. And those where I put out there, normally there's metadata to work off of. You really have to look for landmarks. I'll give an example. I watched a television show. I won't name the show because I don't want to be advertising for anybody, but it wasn't that long ago I was watching a show, and it was a very cool penthouse, apartment. It was gorgeous. Like, gosh, we couldn't figure out what it was. And so I told the person I was with, I said, I think I can figure it out. I looked out the window, froze it, looked out the window, found a landmark, did some digging around, and eventually was able to go back and find the exact location of where that was. And then I backtracked it, checked the production, and it turns out, yes, that was exactly where it was filmed. It's just kind of a fun hobby to do. So you can do it for fun, but what about the nefarious sides of this? How do people protect against that? How do you keep companies like you were just talking about from becoming part of a larger problem in, say, stalking, for instance, or nation state threats or criminal enterprises, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting dialogue around the ethics of open source intelligence and publicly available information. You see a lot of these technologies as they get started, I think, kind of lock their use case down to an approved type of company or an approved type of users. They might have some, free form utilization of it for, basic advertising and to kind of get the impact and value proposition out there into the sphere. But at the end of the day, these are really powerful technologies. And if they are not utilized appropriately, there can be some pretty drastic results. When it comes to open source intelligence and, the novel data sources and technologies behind it, I think, it's always important to remember if we're doing it, then somebody else can be doing it. Nefarious actors absolutely have access to breach data sources online. They absolutely have access to, your public Instagram page that has your profile locations or geotagged photos on top of it. And if somebody is able to leverage artificial intelligence to reference, in, I would say, decent precision, the location of an image, those individuals are also very likely leveraging artificial intelligence to do the same thing. I think there's a very interesting conversation around accountability and ethics and how we utilize these data sources. So some of that's beyond your control, because in film, we talk about mise en scène, which is what is in the scene, and directors will deliberately put things there. But if you're I'm just thinking of a demo that I watched prior to this broadcast. It was basically looking over someone's shoulder and seeing a building out a car window, and then blowing that up and finding that home in the city in which it was located. And it's like, oftentimes you don't have that much control over the environment. You just snap a picture, you put it up there, and you have no idea that that becomes the anchor that somebody is going to use to try to find you. Yeah, I think the longer you spend in this industry, the more jaded you become about your online footprint and what you're putting out there. My social media profiles are nil at this point after spending many years in open source intelligence. And there was a while there, I remember I did a conference, and then we, some publications around access to alt-right, communities online. And my name and my photo was kind of on the author page, and it was talking about Gab and Parler. This was probably 2020 timeframe as things were starting to pick up across those communities. And all of a sudden I noticed, my password resets on my Gmail, on my Instagram started booming. You put your face against, the tracking or collection of some of these communities, and you become, I think, a bit of public enemy number one. And people don't want to be tracked online. And I think when it comes to Telegram or some of these non-indexed communities online, they really have a false sense of security. They think, because I'm on 4chan, nobody, can track who I am, or because I've moved off of Twitter, or I've been banned from Twitter, or from maybe not Twitter anymore, but, this is earlier days, censored from these communities. I've moved elsewhere online, and that then becomes an expectation of privacy. And the reality is there's very little privacy online at this point.
Yeah. Okay. So, they're really positive, powerful technologies that we're talking about here, right? Again, I'm an old school, Intel guy. When I was growing up in Intel space, the technology we're talking about didn't exist. It was all nation state. You couldn't get maps, you couldn't get satellite imagery, you couldn't get all these things. And then companies started bringing that out commercially. I know Google was one of the big ones. There were some others, I'm sure, and then everybody started being able to see that. And then you see where we are today, and the kind of technologies we have available on our phone, again, are things that used to be just, at the nation state level. Now they're cheap or free for anybody. And of course, other nation states who don't have the technology now have access as well. And it makes for a really dangerous world, right? Where you can't, as you said, you can't really protect yourself. Nothing's safe. You've talked about not, being on social media anymore. I've never had a Facebook account in my life, other than, for targeting purposes, Intel versions, but not one of me, of course. And so I guess the question I have is, like, what do you have for advice or thoughts on how do people protect themselves against this? If this is everywhere and it's free and it's easy to get a hold of, what do people do to keep themselves safe? Not everybody's obviously going to be a target of, criminals or countries or whatever, but there's danger all around us. So what do you suggest?
Yeah, I think, good data hygiene, good social media profile hygiene is really what this boils down to. As much as I want to be going around banging my drum that you shouldn't have social media, the reality is people want to engage on these communities online. And I think a really solid understanding of the metadata that is associated with what you're sharing online, how each of these social media communities and apps on your phone are accessing your data. Location data being, as we're talking about geospatial and geospatial intelligence, probably the biggest one here. We can take a look at some of the most recent changes on mainstream apps like Instagram that, by default now within the application are sharing location tags when somebody posts a public story. And now that's accessible, well beyond, I think, somebody's initial understanding, which in history, when posting a story on Instagram and tossing a place tag on was, not something that was creating a lat long of where you publicly are when you post that story. Twitter, in a similar sense, or X, I should say, in the golden age of publicly available information, by default was attaching a lat long metadata to every post. That evolved over time, and now back in kind of 2025 X, there's 3 different versions of location intelligence on somebody's account. Their account location does have metadata with the kind of home location provided on your public profile. Tweets that have a place tag also have metadata attached to it. And there is the ability now, again, to tweet with a specific lat long point coordinate attached to it. All of that is managed solely by somebody's utilization and kind of education of social media. I think there's a whole other dialogue on the back end too of kind of location privileges of apps particularly as it relates to commercial telemetry or ad tech data on your phone. Maybe it's not as obvious to somebody that they're posting a photo on Instagram and putting a place tag on it, but maybe you've allowed your location data to be collected by an app like Amazon or one of the other dozen apps that are doing it on your phone, and they're selling that data. And that data is then collected and sold to other individuals online. Hopefully it's for marketing purposes only, but at the end of the day, the reality is there's, signals data sets out there for sale on the market that do collect mobile device location data, your pattern of life, your movement history, your bed down locations, if you're, taking it from a targeting perspective. That's probably, again, there's kind of the user, what are we posting online? And then there's, what are we actually sharing with our location data and what's happening to it when we add these kind of location privileges to apps on our phone.
You kind of touched upon it a little bit, getting beyond the nation state nefarious uses of this ad tech. There are some, I'm going to qualify it by saying positive uses of GEOINT. Can you talk a little bit about that, like in the commercial space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we're talking about geospatial intelligence in, open source intelligence vendors or software as a service platforms, and, when I say geospatial, I think there's some really fantastic geospatial data out there in kind of the Earth observation. There's imagery, there's radar, there's marine, sensor data. But signals intelligence oftentimes has a geospatial component to it that is now being kind of bundled into GEOINT and OSINT. On the lower side, or maybe more crowdsourced side of that, it could be something like WIGLE, which is going to be crowdsource wireless networks, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular tower triangulation. Can be a really interesting data source, maybe a little less entity or person based, but it's still got lat long location of somebody's Wi-Fi router, and that is a security risk in and of itself. But the commercial telemetry or ad tech side, this is mobile device data from an SDK on your phone that is deeply capable of building really impactful pattern of life workflows and analyses on an individual. It can start as wide as drawing a large geofence over a city and trying to identify devices that don't come from that country. And then once you have that mobile device ID, you can really zero down onto one specific device and look at pattern of life movement over the last 90 days or the last 6 months. Where has this one specific device been, and where are we collecting information on it? I would say outside of the public sector utilization, oftentimes this is just being harnessed for things like marketing, real estate development. Where are boots on the ground most often? Where are these people tending to spend their time? But I think if we are taking an approach from, government utilization, national security utilization, defense, that could look like monitoring troop movement in Russia, monitoring, adversary locations and bed down locations for somebody that is involved in cross-border narcotics. I think there's a lot of utility here that has value, but the inherent risk of this data is that we say open source intelligence oftentimes interchangeably with publicly available information. And the reality is this is not publicly available information. This is very much commercially available information, which has its value. But I think there is a really much needed conversation about how we're bundling all of this under the OSINT umbrella. And what is the ethics? What are the risks here of just boiling this all down to one simple term? There's value, but what are the risks when we consider something like your mobile device data that's being sold and then utilized as publicly available?
Well, yeah, and that's a really good point, right? So, positive use cases. I know we talked a little bit. It comes to mind, something like search and rescue, for instance, or missing persons whether it's somebody who might be young, or it could be somebody who's got a medical condition, the elderly, right? I mean, these are situations I think where being able to access this data can be really, really helpful to track down people, for their own benefit, right, as opposed to stalking somebody or trying to arrest somebody or troop movements or something like that. So there seems to be some positive to this, but you'd also talked about this ad data, right? And so a lot of people wonder, like, well, I show up in a new city or a new town, and all of a sudden, all these ads really seem to hit what I want. Gosh, they know that I'm looking for a new patisserie in a city that I've landed in. How does it know that, right? And I'm going to ask the question I think I may know the answer to, but for the audience anyway, is that what all this is? I've got all these apps on my phone. I've got this activity, all the things we're doing, and all that all comes together. And right, there's a quick customization, and suddenly all the ads match up, and all the things match up to where I am. It's all coming together very rapidly and through technology, right?
I mean, I think you're spot on. It's a part of a larger algorithm conversation, and kind of it's not all just based on the the exact lat long device data on your phone, but there is a substantial amount of location data on your phone via the apps you have installed that are being sold, and that does end up getting used in business and marketing intelligence worldwide. So yeah, if you're seeing location specific ads, sometimes that's it. If they've happened to build a specific mall in a very certain area of town that has high foot traffic, is largely because they figured out that it has high foot traffic for the demographic that they were looking for, based on the demographic data on the apps that they were buying from those apps.
Oh, it's a really good point. So they're actually using it in advance. Hey, we're going to put a store someplace. We should look and see where the people are. Instead of trying to attract people to your store, let's just put the store where the people are, which is actually a brilliant idea from a business standpoint. And unfortunately, we talk to people about, hey, I talk to people all the time, safety and security with your phones, or, whatever. Hey, shut your Wi-Fi off, shut your Bluetooth off, right? You're not going to shut your location data off. Every time you do that, you're going to get a big warning on your phone about all the things that don't work now that your location data is off. Hey, I can't tell you where you are. I can't help you with directions or give you a map, or all the things that you want your phone to be able to do, because it's not just a phone, obviously. It goes, all right, well, you can shut off your location data, but none of this stuff works anymore. Like, you just have a phone in your hand, essentially. Oh my God, I can't do that. So then people turn that stuff back on. So it's not as easy to protect yourself from the sort of customization of your experience as you could by, say, shutting off Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. But it is interesting to know that companies are deciding to put their businesses where the people are, instead of trying to attract, or at least in some cases, instead of trying to attract the people. I hadn't thought of that.
I think when we have these conversations, the reality is it's not all nefarious, right? There's utilization here that is just, capitalist utilization of data. I think the conversation, starts to become, when it comes to the ethics and, moral utilization of this data, where's the onus? Like, is it on the person holding their phone? Is it on the open source intelligence, vendor? Is it on, the government policy and regulation? Like, who's accountable for using this data appropriately? I think it's a little unfair to just say at the, person-based level, we are responsible for, turning off all location data on our phones. The reality is, there are vendors out there that do have a responsibility to leverage this data in a moral and ethical manner. And I think the ethics and OSINT conversation is really interesting, because really it shouldn't be about limiting access to data overall. It's just about protecting trust. We're a pretty new industry. We're seeing a huge amount of maturation in open source intelligence, even just the utilization of the term OSINT in policy and regulation. But if we lose that public trust, the entire discipline loses legitimacy. So I think there are a lot of vendors out there that want to race to the bottom. They want to get the revenue as fast as possible. So they want to get the data that is going to get them that revenue as fast as possible. But in doing so, they are turning a blind eye to their responsibility to the public for what is ethical use of data and what is violating privacy of our citizens.
I've talked about a post-privacy world and some of those things. I'm not sure how far we are from that, but I think that has more to do with people and culture and society as a whole agreeing to that, I suppose.
I was going to take a step back, literally 30,000 foot step back. I know in your past, you've worked with satellites. And the same question to you. It's not always nefarious. It's not always military satellites looking at and so forth. There are commercial satellites that do this as well. Can you speak a little bit about some of the use cases there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, change detection in optical imagery, these are satellites that are, ultimately able to get daily or near daily refresh rate or revisit rate over one specific coordinate on Earth. And what we're seeing in doing so is we are able to really effectively monitor a specific area for changes in terrain, for greenhouse gas emissions monitoring. There's some fantastic companies out there now that are working in government policy regulation. They're working in oil and gas and mining to be able to effectively capture and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions as a result of the optical and infrared imaging on those sensors. That's a fantastic utilization of the data sets. I think we're seeing and have seen optical imagery in use around movement when it comes to civil unrest, when it comes to emigration from conflict areas and conflict zones. The UN has leveraged this in some of the work that they've been doing. That kind of time series data to assess movement and trends becomes incredibly powerful. It's definitely got utilization in the public sector, but if we take a look at where geospatial intelligence, geospatial data and information is being leveraged, it's all the way through insurance to oil and gas to environmental sustainability and monitoring. And there's a tremendous amount of application and value for this data beyond just wartime utilization.
So you were talking about the environment, and I guess when I think of satellite imagery, I'm thinking of looking at something on the ground. But in this case, we're looking at the atmosphere, much like detecting moisture in the atmosphere, the weather satellites routinely do.
Yeah, every satellite has kind of a unique combination of bands in play. Others are going to be, they're more focused on the specific pixels on ground. But if we are able to assess the amount of nitrogen in soil using a satellite and affect the health, then, we are able to drastically improve our ability to monitor crop health, for instance, as opposed to having to manually monitor that yourself on some of these large farms. There's value here that is not just a pretty photo. It's a lot of the times when you look at satellite imagery online or you see it pop up in an article, what you end up seeing is a sub 25 centimeter resolution, high res image of an airport or of a city. And you go, oh, that's nice. That looks nice. I'm not really sure what that's being used for, but great. It looks good. The reality is when we see this being utilized in a, industry setting, a lot of the times it's less to do with that optical imagery and more to do with, your infrared bands, for instance.
So staying with that image of a city, for example, you could take a random shot of that and look at it and say, okay, the angle of the sun is this. The photo was taken roughly at this time of day, and you could get the lat long data that way. Is that correct?
So when we're taking images, we are tasking a satellite to take an image of a specific lat long, right? So mission planning is critical when it comes to these types of satellites. So inherently, when you do get a GeoTIFF file of that image, there is referenced lat long of that image attached to it. It's not just a PNG file at the end of the day. There is, in a similar sense to what we were just chatting about with social media metadata, the metadata of a satellite image is where the value is. That's what we're looking for here, is the metadata on the back end of the image. There's also some really interesting applications around 3D modeling when it comes to satellite imagery. We're talking about urban settings. If we are, effectively taking images frequently of one specific place, being able to go off nadir, so rather than up and down, off nadir on either side, we are able to create really effective 3D models that can be used, again, mineral exploration, mining, or it can be used in more of an urban planning setting. There's just such a tremendous, world of utilization here, where I'm really interested to see this end up getting merged in OSINT is we're talking about satellite imagery, and historically, when talking about GEOINT or geospatial data in the OSINT world, and AJ, you mentioned this, it's a map. it's Google Maps. So we see somebody that says, hey, I've got a geospatial situational awareness tool, and what they actually have is a Google Maps backdrop that they're plotting dots on a map on. They're treating maps like a user interface problem and not an intelligence problem, and they're really not necessarily adding geospatial information that does have intelligence to it. They're just making the picture a little prettier by dropping a map interface on there. So I'm really interested to see the vendors in the space that over the years and continue to innovate here by not just putting pin drops on a map, but context, layering, analysis. How can we look at how locations shift? How can we look at how context evolves over a specific place and time using this really impactful data, as opposed to just making geospatial kind of the backdrop so that we can check off the capabilities.
Well, yeah, you're talking about the difference between Google Maps and ArcGIS. I mean, for instance, right? I mean, and for those who don't know ArcGIS, I don't have time to explain it here. Frankly, and I'm not an expert. James probably could be something you can talk to later, but I've worked with some people who do amazing things with this platform. And then you get into all sorts of just unbelievable technology that can be layered on top of that and give you all sorts of insights, right? You can figure out how water is going to flow through an area, or how air flows through, or you can talk about how the air quality will change depending on heat or depending on whatever's been put in there. You can obviously talk about crops, as you mentioned, you can talk about minerals. It's all these different pieces, and just if you change a slight angle, oh hey, what if we dug the trench this way instead of that way? What if we changed this? What if we built the canal goes this direction instead of that direction? There's so much that can come in there. It's not just a map, right? The map will be able to tell you where the canal is. It won't tell you where you should have put it and why, and what the flow is going to be, and all the obstacles that'll come if you don't build it properly, right? But so I am thinking though, in what Rob had said. So there's a piece that popped into my head. I talk a lot about misdis and malinformation. It's kind of my big pet peeve in life at this point. And I want to talk about it in this terminology because I think Rob was hitting on that. I think he was heading there in terms of, hey, the angle of the sun and the time of day, whatever. So we see a lot of videos that go out and people claim it's something, right? It's somebody's doing something they don't like, whatever. I'm not going to get into too many details and offend somebody, because I'm sure I will. But you can sometimes go back through, and obviously sometimes within the context, you can look and say, well, this is clearly the wrong country. It's the wrong language on signs or whatever it was. But sometimes it's harder to do that. And then, how do we have a chance to maybe look at GEOINT as that and say, well, hold on, this can't be what you're saying. It can't be the right time of day or the right location because of, landmarks, backgrounds, where the sun is located, time of day, et cetera. Some of the things Rob was talking about there. Is that something you've gotten into at all or seen people do well?
It's a really good question. I think it probably is going to, all things geospatial imagery in itself, as well as, our earlier conversation kind of about enriching location of specific, photos. There is going to be an inherent risk here of, is this a real photo? How long until we see AI generated Earth observation images that are being claimed as a specific place that aren't? I think maybe what we're going to be able to decipher here is because it doesn't have that metadata, it is ultimately anything that would be, AI generated or an attempt of a specific place. I would hope that a GEOINT professional will really quickly be able to decipher that by determining what the metadata is on the back end of that image. If it doesn't have, the band information from that satellite, if it doesn't have the metadata that we can, verify, time taken, off nadir, degree, then I'm not going to trust it in the first place. I think it's up to us as analysts, it's up to us as intelligence professionals, GEOINT professionals to, rely on verification, especially now more than ever, where we see, every vendor under the sun claim AI collection or, leverage AI classification, AI translation to, leverage this when possible, but also there has to be a human in the seat doing verification of this. And I think in a similar sense for imagery, there needs to be somebody there verifying, what they have eyes on.
Well, now that the AI is listening and now it knows how you're going to identify when it's AI, I'm sure we're going to start seeing, the metadata is going to be spoofed as well. I mean, you've just taught the AI while we were having this conversation, James. Nice work. The world's out to get us. No, I think it's a good point. I mean, they're not there yet. Again, somebody for nefarious purposes probably will go down that path. You could spoof anything eventually. But, I think you make some good points on what we can do today, at least, as professionals, at least what people better than myself can do to get an idea of, is this real? Is this not real? Because the attacks on truth, on just basic facts, just seem to grow every day. There's people who want to change reality for whatever their purposes are. Whatever, some are doing it for the lols, and some are doing it for other reasons, I'm sure. But I'm always spending a lot more time with professionals and experts like yourself on whatever the technology is saying. Okay, how are we going to combat that? Because it's going to take ethical, honorable OSINTers in a lot of cases, I think, to be able to do that. So anyway, thanks for jumping in next. I was just curious. Go ahead, Rob.
The absence of metadata is something that I'm interested in, because oftentimes from where I sit as like a journalist or whatever, I get an image, but I don't have that background that I can refer to, the details, as you were, of the bandwidth and so forth. So it's always like, well, what can I glean from the image itself? And you were talking about how AI is going to generate an image but not have the metadata there. AI is going to get something wrong. Like if it's showing me a building in Auckland, New Zealand, and it's got the sun in the south, clearly this is a generated image that doesn't know that the other side of the world behaves differently than the northern hemisphere. It's going to take a human to determine some of these things, because there's like 10 billion things that humans know that machines still do not.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely correct. I think where we could probably see some misinformation, disinformation coming here is, maybe we see a nation state posting an image over a certain area and saying, hey, look, we're not here, or we haven't, shot a missile here because this is what it looks like right now. And they're not going to be releasing the GeoTIFF file of that. They might just do a public news release of an image. This, ultimately draws back to when Russia initially invaded Crimea, and they were saying, nope, we are not in Crimea. We're not here. At the time, it was EchoSec, and we were doing exactly what we're talking about here, which is, validation of geospatial data. And the Russians were posting public workouts on Strava in Crimea, and we could see troop movement exactly where they said they were not, based on poor data hygiene and public information online of Strava routes. Strava is still one of the best geospatial publicly available data sets out there as a result of it. I think maybe that's where we see kind of the Earth observation angle here, is having to go out and task trusted satellites to validate what we might be seeing in other public releases of data. That's maybe the closest comparable I could draw.
One of my favorite stories from all these stories of security failures is, of course, military facilities are blacked out on Google Earth, et cetera, et cetera. And then Strava comes along, and we know pretty much what the streets look like in that military facility, because the runners are tracking their runs. And Strava is not under the same rules that Google's under. So,
yeah, it's remarkable. It's a good example of how the best laid plans, right? People have all these great ideas on how they're going to protect things, and then something comes along that they're not prepared for, because you can't control people. You can't control everything. You can't control. There's just too much going on. We're all interconnected. There's everything happening. We've seen lots of those things. I remember fitness watches became a big deal. I worked in the agency, and nobody bothered to ban them at first. And then you started realizing, smartwatches, a fitness watch, things like that, you had to ban them because they have all sorts of things that shouldn't be in the buildings, right? And that's a good example, right? Google Earth's blocking of facilities hasn't quite gone as planned, I don't think. So listen, I think this is a really fascinating conversation. We could probably go on and on about this stuff. I'm going to ask you one more question, and I think we'll get out of here, because I think we're going to run up on time. But I'm curious, in all the times you've been doing this, okay, I lied. I got two questions. I'm going to try to spin them. I'm going to try to pull them together, because they just popped into my head, and then Rob can figure out how to edit it out. So I got two questions. You can edit however you want. So the first one is, your background isn't military, it's not government. You came out of a totally different environment. Can you talk a little bit about that, like backgrounds, other ways to get into GEOINT and to get into this world if you're not coming out of the military or the government? And then the other piece that I'm going to ask, and you can figure out which one you want to keep in the show. In all the times you've been doing this, do you have like a cool, one or two that you can share, like cool stories of, success stories or blunders that you've seen in the world, related to GEOINT?
Yeah, absolutely. All the credit and honor and respect to those in my community and those in the intelligence profession who have served or are actively serving. I don't come from that background. I'm very much on the commercial side of the house these days and started more on the research side of the house. There are so many ways, both in open source intelligence and geospatial intelligence, to get involved in this community. There's fantastic education programs out there. There are some world-class certification programs that you can get involved in. Shout out to Osmosis for some of their, open source intelligence certification programs. I think a really good starting point and kind of launching point. But beyond that, GEOINT, geospatial, OSINT, one of the things I love most is that this is a perennially online community. There is a tremendous amount of opportunity online to get started. AJ, you had kind of mentioned the capture the flag courses. This can be something that starts as just a skilled hobby that you can pivot into a career. There is a tremendous amount of work at education institutions and universities. I'm up in Canada, so I can speak to ours more than the United States. I think corporate organizations oftentimes have GIS roles or geospatial information systems roles that have kind of a flair of Earth observation or imagery attached to it. I had mentioned environmental sustainability. That's an angle that I'm always, preaching and hope that people want to get involved in terms of finding ways to leverage this technology to take care of the Earth that we live on here. Yeah, there's so many different directions we can take it that aren't just serving. I'm online. I'm one of those perennially online humans. So if anybody's ever interested and wants to learn about, different trends in the industry or ways they can get involved, I highly encourage people to reach out to me. Fun stories. Oh man, I've got a lot of fun stories. I'll give one success, one blunder, maybe. I think that's a fun one. So my first foray into geospatial intelligence was working for a Earth observation company that delivered optical imagery, but they also had the world's first ever full color Earth video platform. So this was really novel at the time. I still think, there's some value there. It didn't seem to really totally take off like everybody had hoped. I was working with the organization, and there was kind of a big question mark of, we have this novel technology. What do we do with it? Where are we going to apply it? Who wants to use it? And there was a project that kicked off with a large brand that was doing what they had advertised as the first movie motion picture ever made from space. It was going to be, there's some big actors attached to it, and they planned something called activation. So essentially, the satellite would go over, and they would drive hundreds of Volkswagen buggies around a Dubai desert into a peace sign. And in everybody's heads, we thought, wow, this is cool. We're going to be a part of something tremendous. And I've seen the actors' names on here, and this is going to be really exciting. And everybody got together and we filmed some really fantastic stuff. And then when the movie dropped, you realize, this is 1 meter. This isn't, a camera in front of somebody's face. This is top down, some buggies driving around in a circle. So there was a short film released, but I think the actual satellite footage that we spent months of our life planning and, dozens of people and analysts course correcting videos and mission taskers accounted to about 15 seconds of footage across this entire video. They got to check their box to say it was done from space. We, were solely disappointed in the impact that, space video was going to have in the movie industry. But that was my first kind of foray into GEOINT, and I think ever since then I kind of got spooked from working with the entertainment industry more than some other impactful industries. Success. I mean, we could go for days here. I won't go into specific cases, but I will say, spending 8 years now in open source intelligence with the geospatial intelligence lens attached to it, I continue to be, most drawn to and, have the most fulfillment behind supporting use cases around counter trafficking. I've worked on some really fantastic cases with some really powerful teams. Again, if I'm going to give kind of a brief shout out, there's a really powerful nonprofit in our industry right now called Skull Games that is empowering current and former Intel professionals to essentially identify victims of trafficking and the traffickers themselves. A really incredible group that has seen a tremendous amount of success. And one of the things that I have really taken home from time spent with them in the past and continuing to kind of cheer on my colleagues that are there is the various backgrounds that we need in this industry to see success. And one of the things that I really value about an organization like Skull Games is they are actively partnering intelligence professionals with survivors of trafficking themselves. And as we're talking about kind of super locators and people that can see a location in an image, sometimes that's all you have to go on in a world like that. You might have an Instagram photo and you just have a background in that photo and you're trying to identify somebody who is missing, you're trying to identify somebody who's been trafficked, and to see kind of the merge of all these people with various life experiences and the successes and rescues of victims of trafficking has been, one of the highlights of my career.
That is a good note to end on, a very positive use of all this technology and knowledge. James, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys. This was a pleasure.
And you can learn more about James and where to find him in our show notes. You can also find transcripts and other episodes. We're approaching 100 episodes of NeedleStack, so this is pretty cool. Where do you find them? It's at authenticate.com/NeedleStack. That's authentic with an 8.com/NeedleStack. And there's also a comment button there. And I know AJ reads all of the comments. So please feel free to leave a comment for one or both of us. And be sure to let us know your thoughts on social media. You can find us just about everywhere under the symbol @NeedleStackPod. And very important, wherever you're listening to us or watching us today, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out any episodes in the future. AJ?
No, I think that's it. I appreciate it. As Rob said, please feel free to leave comments. I love to read them all. I certainly don't use my OSINT skills to track down people who say negative things about me. But no, honestly, the show's about the people on the show, and it's about the people who watch and listen to the show. It's not about Rob or myself. So, we do care about feedback. We want this to be a show that's entertaining and it's educational and it's interesting. A good use of your time. So, if you have questions, if you want ideas to improve it, if you know somebody who should be on the show, please do reach out. Let us know. We want to make this the best show we can for people who are taking the time, to be involved. As you said, James, thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Really interesting stuff, all the way through. I hope people do reach out and get more information from you as well. Everybody tries to figure out a better way to protect themselves while learning, about all the things we can find in the world and the positives that come out of it. So, with that in mind, again, thanks to everybody involved. I think we're going to go ahead and just close it out for this episode. So this has been another episode of NeedleStack.